Hey everyone, it's Emily, and things are looking rather grim on the physical media side of the Switch console systems that we've been hearing throughout the news these last few weeks. And I'm sure we've all heard of game key cards and how these are just a poor substitute of game cards that have been so beloved in the Switch lifecycle that a lot of collectors are kind of second guessing whether or not a Switch 2 really makes sense for them to purchase. And today I wanted to address things such as game key cards, but also other pieces of the puzzle that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about, and how it's helped me kind of paint a picture of how physical media friendly the Switch 2 as well as the original Switch will be in the next few years. So I'll first address the game key card situation, which is probably the most devastating blow to physical media collectors we've had in recent years, because we all thought Nintendo would be the last one to hold out when it comes to have true physical games available on their systems. And while their first-party games all seemingly have true physicals that are available, though at, of course, higher price points, a lot of the third-party developers have all opted to put their games on, whether they're large in size or not so large in size. So it's been rather confusing understanding why some of these third-party developers are opting for these game key cards rather than a true physical game card. There's been a lot of speculation that there's only a couple sizes available for third-party developers to put their games on that are really expensive. So either they could have their full game on a 64 gigabyte card, or they're going to have to figure out some way to squeeze their game on an 8 gigabyte size one. So this has been the popular theory so far, and that's why we are seeing games like Bravely Default HD Remaster, which is 11 gigabytes in size, opting for the game key card route, because it's not retailing for $60, it's only retailing for $40. And so maybe Square Enix didn't want to opt for that 64 gigabyte size game cart for their Switch 2 release. But then again, you have developers like CD Projekt Red who are putting Cyberpunk 2077 fully on that 64 gigabyte card, along with the DLC. So I don't know who's to blame. Is this a Nintendo issue because of them subjecting the developers just to these two sizes, or is it the developers who are cheapening out for probably the cheaper game key card instead of an actual Switch 2 game card? So the game key card may make sense because if they're only limited to, say, 64 gigabytes for their game, and you have a massive game that requires a lot more room, maybe going the game key card route as well as digital only route makes sense for those games. But this doesn't entirely explain the rapid adoption that we've been seeing among many third-party developers, especially for smaller games that are way less than 64 gigabytes. Now, we've been seeing reveals, especially in Japan right now, of a lot of these third-party games are just going the key card route. One reason for this may just be the current Japanese economy, and so a lot of publishers over there are trying to cut corners as much as possible to keep game prices low, so that people will buy them over there. We've been seeing also special prices for the Switch 2 console, retailed about $100 less over there compared to elsewhere in the world, just to, again, accommodate the really poor exchange rates in Japan right now. So that may explain why some publishers in Japan are opting for the game key card route right now around launch, just, again, due to the Japanese economy. And we've been seeing some examples out here in the West of games that may be only getting a game key card in Japan, but are actually getting a true physical here in the West. One example of this is with the Daemon X Machina sequel, which is getting a true physical out here in the West, but in Japan, they're only opting for the game key card. So there might be some distinction, again, just how publishers are going about the physical media situation. So we may continue seeing regional differences of game key cards and true physicals for certain titles. And we might see the opposite, where maybe Japan will get a true physical and here in the West, we'll only get the game key card instead. This may have further implications of how complete the carts will be, because a lot of games, some of the regions have a more complete cart compared to others. And so it's a little bit unfortunate that if, say, here in the West, maybe we won't see a complete on-cart game, but Japan would later on, because sometimes the publishing cycles are different. And so only having one region have a true physical may just make this situation, if you're into collecting complete on-cart games, a little bit more difficult. So from what it looks like right now, it does look like the Switch 2 will continue to be region-free. The only issues with region coding right now is in Japan, they only have a region-locked console system. That just to lock in that special price that Japanese residents get compared to the rest of the world. But hopefully that's not going to cross over to software. We haven't really seen any evidence of that so far. Which leads me to talking about Play Asia and other Southeast Asian English games are going to be available on the market. And so this is the piece of the puzzle that I think a lot of people are not talking about, which could have really bad implications to a lot of physical media collectors, because there have been many cases on the original Switch where a game was maybe available digitally out here in the West, but we never received a true physical. So a lot of people like to import those games from the Southeast Asian regions or any kind of region that included, say, English on their game cart. And we saw a lot of that, especially from stores like Play Asia, offering these Asian English imports. And the reason for this was because the Nintendo eShop was not available in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. But it looks like that's about to change with the Switch 2. So from my understanding, this has been in the works for quite some time, but when the Switch 2 launches in June, very shortly, a lot of Southeast Asian countries are going to have an eShop available to them for the first time. So this includes countries like Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And again, they've never had a eShop before, so they didn't have a lot of digital games available to their region. And that's why a lot of physicals that we don't see out here in the West, a lot of them were available on websites like Play Asia that catered to these Asian English releases for those countries. And so the reason why this is really probably devastating to the Asian English market is if these games are going to become available digitally, they're probably going to be seeing these game key cards if they have a physical available to them, because that's so much cheaper than having a true physical game cart. So my speculation is we're actually not going to have too many different Asian English imports available to us for the Nintendo Switch 2. I think a lot of people were hoping that the import market would be just as good for the Switch 2 as it was for the Switch 1, or maybe even better because of this introduction of game key cards. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the case. And we've had examples on the original Switch of having larger sizes available to the Asian English imports compared to, say, what we got in the US. There are a couple examples of this, but the most popular one is probably with the Final Fantasy X HD collection, where the first Final Fantasy X game was available on the cart, but inside the box, they also included a digital download code for 10.2. But if you were to import instead from Play Asia, both Final Fantasy X and 2 were on a larger cart there. So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be seeing this because of just how much more expensive those games are physically. And I highly doubt if an eShop is available that companies like Square Enix is going to opt for a larger cart size in one region and not in another. So it's highly likely we're not going to see too many examples of where one region is going to have the full game available on the game cart physical compared to the game key card download. So unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be a rather mixed bag when it comes to regional differences for the physical Switch 2 games. And I have a feeling that a lot of publishers are probably going to go with the game key cards over the true physicals. So in addition to the regional differences we've been seeing for some of these Switch 2 releases, there's also been some talk that maybe some sort of other entity is going to come in and kind of step up the true physical game, where if maybe at retail, only a game key card's available for certain games, you might have someone step in and maybe make an option for true physicals. There's some speculation with limited run games potentially, or someone similar, that if they are able to negotiate with some of these companies, they might be able to sell on the side a true physical of these games, maybe at a higher price. So far, we don't really see any indication of this. Recently, the Raito Remastered from Sega and Atlas released a collector's edition through Limited Run Games, and they're only having a game key card Switch 2 physical available, which again kind of defeats the whole premise of what limited run games is supposed to stand by with physical forever. But that aside, it doesn't look like, at least at this moment, maybe places like limited run games will offer an option for a true physical. Now, that could definitely change down the road, especially if there's demand. I could definitely see that happening. The question is, how much more expensive will that be? And is this just going to be in little small windows of this becoming available? If that's the case, I could see the market for these being kind of expensive, especially among physical collectors, and kind of just wish these were just available at retail so we don't have to have the headache of worrying about this. Now, on the other spectrum, we've also been hearing places like Video Games Plus put out statements that wouldn't it be nice if we were to sell some of these game key cards as true physicals? And I don't really know how much power places like Video Game Plus or other retail stores have in making that happen. But I'm sure if someone was to make it happen, maybe a place like Video Games Plus could negotiate with some of these publishers and allow small batches of true physicals to become available. Now, again, I have a feeling that would be more expensive than these game key cards, but I'm sure there would be plenty of people willing to pay if that option were to become available. Again, none of this has been confirmed, but there have been statements of people wanting to see this. So this has been so far what I've been able to gather regarding game key cards and how they're really probably going to be the driving force of killing physical media on the Switch 2, primarily with their third-party support. Now, when it comes to first party, I don't think we're going to be seeing too many options for those games, seeing the game key cards at all. I think this is going to be mostly revolved around third-party publishers and their games. Whether they're going to be huge in size, so it's not really feasible to fit their games on a 64 gigabyte cart, or it's just going to be too expensive for them to support in multiple regions. So one solution to this third-party game key card situation is a lot of these games are having true physicals published just on the original Switch, but not the Switch 2. So I think during this transition period, a lot of collecting will still be alive and well on the original Switch, which kind of stinks, especially if there are some enhancements that you would want to have maybe on the Switch 2 for some of these games, especially if they're competing with other consoles like on Xbox or PlayStation 5, where they'll just have a more enhanced experience. And I think there's been a lot of complaints over these last couple of years of how poorly optimized a lot of the Switch 1 games are. So hopefully we won't be seeing a lot of true physicals in that state continue. But being realistic, it's probably going to happen for a lot of these third-party games that don't want to just cater towards the old Switch system. Another interesting caveat when it comes to the collectability of Switch 2 games is it looks like some of the true physical games for the Switch 2 are actually playable on the Switch 1. And this might be something we'll see for a few physical games, at least in this kind of crossover transitionary period. So the Rune Factory, or the new Rune Factory that's coming out, has this feature where if you were to buy the Switch 2 game cart that's red and everything, and you were to insert it in your original Switch, it should be totally playable, at least the Switch 1 version. So the only difference between the original and the Switch 2 game carts is not only the $10 price tag difference, but also that the Switch 2 version has a separate file that you can download natively in the cart that will have the enhancements for the Switch 2 if you were to put it in a Switch 2 system. It's just not available when you insert it into your original Switch console. So this is kind of a neat little feature where if you don't really want to be an early adopter of the Switch 2 console, you can still buy a Switch 2 game and play it on your original Switch. Now, I don't know if this will be a heavily adopted strategy for a lot of these kind of transitionary games between the Switch 1 and Switch 2 cycles, but I think that's a really cool option to have, especially if you don't really know if you'll be fully adopting the Switch 2 console anywhere in the near future. But one thing that will be interesting to track over these next few years is how much support the original Switch will have and continue to have. Because if you look at Sony, they were releasing a lot of cross PS5 and PS4 support at the same time. Now, this may be because of the pandemic, and a lot of people just didn't have PS5 games or want to switch over. So they kept releasing the same games on the PS4 with the ability to upgrade later on. I wonder if we'll see that sort of pattern on the Switch and Switch 2. I have a feeling we will, but maybe not to the extent that Sony had for PS4 and PS5. And while right now the pre-order sales look to be doing really well for the Switch 2, I'm not really sure how much support the Switch 2 will have in the general population among casual gamers will be in the coming years. Because right now, just the hardcore gamers are pre-ordering the Switch 2 and selling them out, of course. That makes headlines, right? But I don't know exactly, again, how long the original Switch games that will have the full physical will continue on. Hopefully for a good amount of time, especially if we're not going to see true physicals on the Switch 2, especially among third-party developers. But I think we're going to be seeing maybe more transition among collectors to the PS5 when it comes to collecting games. I spoke on this in my last video, how there's been a misconception that these game key cards are the same as what we've been seeing on PS5 and Xbox, when that's really not been the case, at least not to this extent, because most games, again, that have been coming out the last couple years are completely playable on these platforms without any need to be online or have patches done. Now, you might be seeing day one patches just to enhance these games that we never really saw back in the day because we were just okay with bugs or games not being perfect. But for the most part, I think a lot of games right now are totally playable. And I think we're going to see, again, more collectors shift over to PS5 games for modern titles. Now, I don't know how widely adopted this will be, but I know for myself, if I really want a true physical that's only available on the PS5, I'll probably go that route. But if a game is only available on, say, the Switch 2 game key card or digital elsewhere, I'm going to opt probably for digital, but on PC, and kind of skip console altogether for these games. This is maybe a broader conversation of the importance of physical media, but myself and many others are really disappointed with sort of the trajectory of the Switch 2 and how it's really shoving us towards the digital future at a rate that is a little bit too fast, at least in my opinion. And I could hear probably plenty of people say, at least in the comments, that this is inevitable and you better get used to it because this is how games are going to kind of proceed moving forward. And again, I don't think we necessarily need to give in to this so-called inevitable future. I think there are many different routes that we can consider of how to approach physical game collecting. I think there's definitely a reason why physical game collecting is important to have as an option. And hopefully this little bump in the road of what we've seen so far with the Switch 2 isn't at the scale that it's kind of indicating. And hopefully there'll be more options of, say, cart sizes of what games will be available and ways to cut costs down so that physical media is still an option for future games on the system. But kind of as of now, I'm not really looking at the Switch 2 as a primary way to buy and play games. I think it's probably going to be mostly just my first party Nintendo console. So I might just buy games of my favorites like the Xeno or Monolith Soft games, as well as Fire Emblem. But everything else, especially a third party, I'm probably going to go and seek it out elsewhere. Which, as of what we've seen about the Switch 2 so far, I don't think that's going to be an unpopular route to go down. But anyway, I'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts are in the state of physical collecting for the Switch console systems moving forward, and whether or not you plan on collecting for the Switch 2. And if you are, how do you plan to go about it? But that's everything from me here today. And so until my next video, bye guys.